The office was silent. Employees stared. No one dared to speak. A furious manager leaned over a black employee's desk, finger in her face. "You are done here," he barked. Her expression? Calm. Unshaken. He thought she was just another worker. But he had no idea who she really was. And soon, he would regret everything. The office was buzzing with tension. Something was coming. Everyone could feel it. The soft hum of printers, the rhythmic tapping on keyboards, the occasional murmur between coworkers. Everything felt off. A silent storm was brewing. Then, the heavy footsteps began. Mr. Richard Coleman, the senior manager, feared, arrogant, ruthless. And today, he was furious. His jaw clenched as he stormed across the office floor, his eyes locked on one person, and everyone knew who. Ava Sinclair. She sat calmly at her desk, typing away. Her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard. If she sensed the brewing storm, she didn't show it. She didn't flinch. She didn't pause. She didn't even look up. But everyone else did. Because when Coleman stormed towards someone was getting fired. Employees exchanged nervous glances. Some lowered their heads, pretending to focus on work. Others grabbed their phones, anticipating a spectacle. This was a showdown. Coleman's shiny leather shoes clicked against the floor. His breathing was heavy. His face was red. He was a man on a mission. And that mission? Destroy Ava Sinclair. Then, bam! His palm crashed onto her desk. A few employees gasped. Ava? She kept typing, like nothing happened. Coleman's eye twitched. You! His voice dripped with venom. Ava finally looked up. Her expression unshaken, calm, even bored. Coleman's rage boiled. You do not belong here. Silence. Every pair of eyes in the office was locked on them. Phones had stopped ringing. Typing had ceased. Even the air felt heavier. Ava tilted her head. Her eyes studied him. But she said nothing. Coleman took a step closer, towering over her, breathing hard. You have no business working here, he hissed. You are incompetent, unqualified, a waste of company resources. The words sliced through the air. No one dared to speak. Ava blinked. That was it. No fear, no panic. Coleman clenched his fists. He expected her to plead, to argue, to beg. She did none of those things. His patience snapped. A wicked grin spread across his face. Pack your things. His voice was dripping with arrogance. You are fired. Effective immediately. The final blow. The verdict was given. The sentence was passed. And just like that, it was over. Or so he thought. Because what he didn't know. Ava Sinclair wasn't just an employee. And in a few minutes, he would regret everything. The office was frozen in time. No one moved. No one spoke. Eyes darted between Coleman and Ava, waiting, anticipating a response. Ava slowly exhaled, her gaze unwavering. She leaned back in her chair, fingers tapping lightly on the desk. Coleman expected fear, desperation, a weak attempt to beg for her job. Instead, she smirked. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough to make Coleman uncomfortable. The color in his face darkened. You think this is funny? He snapped. Ava's voice was even, controlled. I think you should be very sure of your decision, Mr. Coleman. Something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, for the first time. But his ego wouldn't allow it. I do not answer to you, he snapped. Ava raised a brow. Are you sure? Coleman's lips parted, then shut. Somewhere in the office, someone let out a nervous chuckle. Coleman's face twisted with rage. You have 10 seconds to get up and leave this building before I call security. He turned to HR, motioning them forward. They hesitated. The entire energy in the room shifted. Something wasn't right. But Coleman was too arrogant to notice. Ava finally stood. She straightened her blazer, adjusted her sleeves. Then, she picked up her phone, tapped the screen, one button, and held it up to her ear. The entire office held their breath. Coleman scoffed. Who do you think you are calling? A deep voice answered immediately. Put me on speaker. Ava smiled, then pressed the button. The room went silent. Then came the voice. Richard Coleman, you just made the biggest mistake of your career. The office froze in disbelief. Some employees gripped their desks, too stunned to move. Others glanced at each other, whispering. But most, they were recording. Phones discreetly raised. Screens flickered. Cameras captured every second. Because what was happening? This was history. Coleman's chest puffed out. his voice dripping with arrogance. He thought he was untouchable. "You people never last here," he sneered, folding his arms. The air grew thick. The words hung. Heavy. Ugly. "Ava?" She tilted her head. Her eyes studied him. Unshaken. Unmoved. Then she spoke. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Coleman?" Her voice? Calm. Steady. Controlled. And for the first time, Coleman's smirk faltered. Just for a second. His arrogance cracked. But then, his ego took over. He scoffed. "I make the rules here." His voice rose, desperate to maintain control. "You are gone. Effective immediately." His hands slammed onto his desk. HR flinched. Some employees gasped. But Ava? She did not even blink. And then, Coleman turned and froze, because he saw them, the executives, standing near the entrance, watching. Whispers spread. Murmurs grew. The power shift had begun. But Coleman? He was too arrogant to see the trap closing in. His face turned red. "HR, escort her out!" he barked. The HR reps? They did not move. Not one step. Instead, they exchanged nervous glances. Coleman's jaw tightened. "Did you not hear me?" he snapped. His confidence wavered. Ava, however, she smirked. A subtle, knowing smirk. One that made Coleman's stomach turn. He felt it now. Something was wrong. His eyes darted around. The entire office was watching, recording. And then, one of the executives stepped forward. Coleman stiffened. "Mr. Coleman," the man said, voice firm, "step away from Ms. Sinclair." The color drained from Coleman's face. "Excuse me," he stammered. "You heard me," the executive said. "You are crossing a line. Step away." The air shifted. Power had changed hands, and Coleman knew it, but he refused to accept it. His hands shook with anger. "This is absurd," he hissed. "Ava Sinclair is a—" The executive held up a hand. Enough. The authority in his voice? Unshakable. Coleman clenched his fists. His entire world was slipping away. Ava had not even moved. And yet, she had won. Employees held their breath, waiting for the next move. And then, the final blow. The executive turned to Ava. "Ms. Sinclair," he said, "we need to have a discussion." In the boardroom. Gasps rippled through the office. The boardroom? That was for executives, for decision-makers, not employees. Coleman's face contorted in confusion. "Wait, what?" he blurted. Ava finally moved. She straightened her blazer, picked up her phone, and turned to him. Her eyes were calm, powerful. "I told you to be sure, Mr. Coleman." Her voice? Deadly. Final. Then, she walked past him, head high, shoulders back, like she owned the place. Coleman? He stood frozen, sweating, shaking, because for the first time in his career, he had no control. And the realization hit him like a freight train. The cameras were still rolling, the office was still watching, and his downfall had begun. Ava picked up her phone, tapped one button. That was all it took. Coleman scoffed, his arms crossing over his chest. "Who do you think you're calling?" he sneered. His voice dripped with condescension, mocking, dismissive, like she was nobody, like she was nothing. But Coleman? He had no idea. The phone rang once, twice. The room was silent. Then, a deep voice answered. "Put me on speaker." Ava's lips curled into a small smile. She pressed the button. The voice boomed through the office speakers. "Richard Coleman, you just made the biggest mistake of your career." A sharp inhale rippled through the office. Employees froze, eyes widened, whispers spread. But Coleman? His smirk disappeared. His face turned pale. Ava finally stood, slowly, deliberately. She adjusted her blazer, smoothing the fabric as if she had all the time in the world. Every move was calculated. Every motion dripped with power. Coleman's mouth opened, then shut. He tried to speak, but no words came. Ava's eyes met his, cold, unshaken, and then she spoke. "Mr. Coleman," she said smoothly, her voice measured, dangerous. "Let me introduce myself properly." The air in the room thickened. The tension was suffocating. Ava took a slow step forward. Coleman's breath hitched. Employees leaned in, their eyes darting between the two. "My name is Ava Sinclair," she continued. Her voice was steady, controlled, and somehow more powerful than ever. Coleman's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. He opened his mouth, ready to counter, but Ava raised a finger. And just like that, he shut up. "I am not just an employee," she stated. Her voice was razor sharp. She took another step forward. You just insulted and publicly humiliated the one person in this company you should have never crossed. Coleman stiffened. His eyes darted around. The executives were still watching. Their expressions? Unreadable. HR stood frozen, unsure whether to step in or step back. Ava let the silence stretch. Let it sink in. Then, the voice on the phone spoke again. Mr. Coleman, do you realize who you have been speaking to? Coleman's breath caught. His throat was suddenly dry. His arrogance was crumbling. His power was fading. And Ava? She was just getting started. She took another step forward, now standing inches away, towering over him in a way that had nothing to do with height, staring him down, unshaken, unmoved, unstoppable. A slow smirk curved on her lips. I am Ava Sinclair, she repeated. Her voice dripped with authority. And then, she delivered the final blow. And I am on the board of directors. The office erupted. Gasps, whispers, a ripple of pure, absolute shock. Coleman staggered back. His hands trembled. His face, ghostly white. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The world around him spun. This was not happening. This could not be happening. But it was. And now, he was finished. The tension in the office was unbearable. Some employees exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others sat frozen, their fingers hovering over keyboards, too stunned to type. The executives near the door remained still, expressionless, watching. And then, Ava's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. A text. From the CEO. One sentence. Bring Coleman to the boardroom, immediately. Ava lifted her gaze, locked eyes with Coleman, and smiled. Mr. Coleman, she said, her voice cool, composed. The board of directors would like to have a word with you. The final nail in the coffin. The last power shift. Coleman staggered. His legs felt weak. And the worst part? The cameras were still rolling, employees still recording, and his downfall had just begun. The tension in the office was unbearable. No one moved. No one breathed. Every eye was locked on Ava Sinclair. And then, she spoke. I am Ava Sinclair, the new regional director. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone dropped their pen. A chair creaked as an employee shifted, trying to process what had just been said. Coleman? His jaw dropped, frozen in place, staring at Ava like he had just seen a ghost. HR gasped. The executives nodded. No one in the room could believe it. And then, the whispers started. No way. He fired his own boss? Is this real? Did that just happen? Coleman's face twitched. He blinked, processing, trying to catch up to the reality crashing down around him. Ava? She simply folded her arms, her expression calm, collected, powerful. And then, she delivered the final blow. And you just fired me, in front of witnesses. More gasps, more stunned whispers. But Coleman? He was panicking. He shook his head. His hands flew up, desperate. I didn't know, he stammered. Ava tilted her head, mocking, studying, watching him crumble. You didn't know? She repeated, voice smooth. Coleman's breathing hitched. He nodded rapidly. It was a misunderstanding. He rushed out. I thought you were just a normal employee. Ava raised an eyebrow. Just a normal employee? Coleman froze. He had said the wrong thing, again. Because now the entire office saw it. They saw through him, saw exactly who he was. And Ava? She had no mercy. She stepped forward. Tell me, Coleman, she said, her voice deadly calm. Would you have treated a normal employee any differently? More whispers. Coleman's throat bobbed. He had no answer. Ava narrowed her eyes. Would you have screamed at them? Humiliated them? Insulted them? She took another step. Would you have mocked them for who they are? Coleman backed up. His chest heaved. His mind raced. He needed to fix this. He needed to fix this now, but it was already too late. Because the cameras were still rolling. Because the executives were still watching. Because the damage was already done. And then, Ava turned. She faced HR. She faced the executives, her expression unreadable. And she spoke. What is company policy on wrongful termination? HR flinched. The lead executive cleared his throat. The entire office held its breath. And then, the executive nodded, and said the words that sealed Coleman's fate. Termination without cause. results in immediate investigation and suspension of the hiring manager. The room erupted. Gasps, chatter, employees whispering frantically. And Coleman? He was shaking. His hands curled into fists. His face turned white. "No," he whispered. "Number. No, no, no." But it was too late. HR stepped forward. They held out a document. "Richard Coleman," the HR manager said, voice firm. "You are suspended, effective immediately." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Coleman stumbled back. "Wait," he gasped. He turned to the executives, his voice desperate. "You can't do this." But the lead executive? He shook his head. "Actually, it is long overdue. The final nail, the final blow." Coleman's world collapsed. His power, gone. His job, gone. And Ava? She stood tall, untouchable, powerful, and completely in control. The room was dead silent, except for the sound of footsteps. Firm, purposeful. The executive team stepped forward. Their faces? Stone cold, unforgiving. Coleman's breath hitched. His fingers twitched. His entire world was collapsing. One of the executives, an older man with icy blue eyes, stopped in front of him. He tilted his head. His gaze was unreadable. Then, in a voice sharp as steel, he said, "Mr. Coleman, please come with us." Coleman froze. His face turned beet red. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He glanced around, searching for help, for an ally, for someone to speak up. But there was no one. Not a single person in the office stepped forward for him. Not one. HR held up a file, a thick one, too thick. And when the HR director spoke, her voice was cold. "Final. We need to discuss your behavior, Mr. Coleman." Coleman's stomach dropped. He licked his lips, opened his mouth, closed it, tried to breathe, tried to think. But then, Ava moved. She tapped her phone. Once, twice. Her expression? Unbothered, calm, in control. And then, she delivered the final crushing blow. And let us not forget, this is all on video. Gasps rippled through the office. Coleman's hands shook, his body swayed. No, 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 not video, not proof. But it was too late, because in seconds, the recording spread like wildfire. Employees grabbed their phones, screens lit up, whispers turned into full conversations. The sound of notifications exploded as messages pinged across the company. Coleman staggered. This was not just a meeting. This was not just an HR review. This was the end. And then, it got worse, much worse. Because then, the employees finally spoke up. A voice from the back. "He has been doing this for years!" Gasps. A few heads snapped toward the voice. A young woman, trembling, but standing her ground. She pointed at Coleman. "He humiliated me 3 months ago. Screamed at me in front of everyone." Another voice. "He made me work overtime without pay, and threatened to fire me if I refused." And then another. "He called me too emotional when I stood up for myself." The stories kept coming, one after another. A floodgate had opened. And Coleman? He stood there, frozen, trapped, unable to escape. The HR director's eyes darkened. Her grip on the file tightened. She took a deep breath. And then, she spoke the words that sealed Coleman's fate. "We will be reviewing every complaint." Coleman choked. His body felt heavy. His kingdom, his power, was gone. For the first time in his career, he was no longer in control. Ava tilted her head. She studied him. Then, her lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "Seems like your past is finally catching up with you, Mr. Coleman." The room erupted. Gasps. Murmurs. Some employees nodded. Some whispered. Others, they simply watched. Watching as justice unfolded. Watching as karma took its course. And then, the lead executive turned. His expression? Pure authority. "Escort him out of the building, now." HR stepped forward. Security moved instantly. Coleman stumbled back. "No! No! Wait!" His voice was panicked. "This is all a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job. I did not mean—" But no one was listening. No one cared. Coleman's pleas fell on deaf ears. His voice shook. His knees wobbled. His breathing turned ragged. And Ava? She just watched. Unshaken. Untouched. Unbothered. Because the truth? This was not revenge. This was justice. And it was long overdue. Coleman's legacy had crumbled. And now, it was time to face the consequences. Coleman sat in the cold, sterile conference room. arms crossed, jaw tight, sweat beading at his temples. The walls felt like they were closing in. He forced a fake smile, tried to compose himself, tried to salvage whatever power he had left. But the silence in the room was deadly. Across the table, the executive team sat with stone-cold faces. HR legal. And in the center, Ava Sinclair, the woman he fired, his boss. Coleman cleared his throat, forced out a laugh. Look, this is all a misunderstanding. His voice shook. No one reacted. Coleman shifted, tried again. I did not mean... He was cut off by the voice of doom. Cold, sharp, final. We have you on video, Richard. Coleman's mouth snapped shut. His heart dropped. The lead executive sat back, folded his hands, and stared. Not with anger, not with sympathy, but with pure, calculating judgment. The kind of stare that meant only one thing. You're done. HR pulled out a thick file, a stack of complaints. Coleman's past sins laid out in black and white. The HR director cleared her throat and began to read. Multiple reports of discrimination. Coleman's stomach twisted. Verbal harassment toward employees. His fingers dug into the armrests. Abuse of power. Retaliation. Creating a hostile work environment. Coleman's face lost all color. His head spun. He tried to protest, tried to deny, but every single accusation came with proof. Emails, witness statements, recordings, undeniable evidence. Coleman's breathing turned shallow. His throat felt dry. His hands felt cold. And then, when he could not take it anymore, he snapped, slamming his fists on the table. "This is ridiculous," he roared. The room stayed silent. But his voice, it echoed, loud, desperate, weak. He pointed a shaking finger at the executives. "I built this company," he spat. His voice cracked. "I gave everything to this place." Ava? She did not flinch. She did not blink. She simply leaned in and whispered, "And now you are destroying it." Coleman's breath caught. Her words sliced through his arrogance, his ego, his delusions. Because deep down, he knew she was right. The executive team exchanged glances. Their decision had already been made. And now, it was time to deliver it. The lead executive turned to HR, gave a small nod, and then, the HR director picked up the termination letter. Signed, sealed, ready. She slid it across the table. "Mr. Coleman, your employment is terminated. Effective immediately." The words rang out, felt like a gunshot. Coleman stared, as if the paper was a death sentence. His hands trembled. He wanted to fight, to scream, to deny. But the truth? There was nothing left to say. It was over. Ava stood, smoothed her blazer. "Security will escort you out," she said, voice calm. Coleman's world collapsed. His career, gone. His power, stripped. His reputation, destroyed. And as he was dragged from the room, Ava, she simply watched, unshaken, unbothered, completely in control. The next morning, the office was buzzing. Whispers, murmurs, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. And then, a ping. Emails flooded every inbox. Subject, termination of employment. Richard Coleman. The office went dead silent. Eyes widened, mouths fell open. And then, the reactions came fast. Gasps, soft chuckles. And then, one by one, smirks. People leaned back in their chairs. Some exchanged knowing looks. Others whispered, "No way. Is this real? They actually fired him?" Guess karma finally caught up. But while the email sent shockwaves through the office, the real moment, the one they would never forget, it happened 20 minutes later, when security stepped off the elevator and walked straight to Richard Coleman's office. A few employees stood up. Some peeked over cubicles. Others pretended to work, but their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. Coleman sat at his desk, stiff, his face blank, emotionless, but his hands white-knuckled, clenching the armrests. He saw them coming. He knew what this was, and yet, he still held on to the last sliver of denial. Security stopped at his desk. One officer, tall and built, cleared his throat. "Mr. Coleman, it is time to go." The words hit like a hammer. Coleman's body tensed. He exhaled sharply, forced himself to stand. And then, security handed him a cardboard box, a small, pathetic box, the final insult, the last humiliation. His entire career, reduced to this. Slowly, mechanically, He began to pack. Stapler. Notebooks. A framed picture of himself from an old award ceremony. He paused. Stared at it. Then, with a tight jaw, shoved it into the box. The office was silent. Not a single employee spoke. But their eyes said everything. Some looked relieved. Others, satisfied. The arrogant boss. The bully. The tyrant. Finally, gone. As Coleman walked toward the elevator, security flanking him, he felt it. The whispers. The weight of dozens of eyes watching his downfall. He kept his chin high, his steps even, but he felt the shame crawl up his spine. And then, as he passed one of the cubicles, a voice, software mocking. "You're fired." A flicker of rage crossed Coleman's face, but he did not turn around. Could not. Because the truth, there was nothing left to say. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open. Coleman stepped inside. The final moment. The last goodbye. Before the doors shut forever. And then, it was over. Just like that. The office let out a collective breath. A tension that had lived in these walls for years was finally gone. And in the corner office, Ava Sinclair watched. From behind her glass window, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Her gaze followed him until the very last second. And when the elevator doors closed, she turned, faced the HR director. Her voice was calm, clear, final. "Let's make sure no one else like him rises here again." The HR director nodded. The message was clear. A new era had begun, and the Coleman era was nothing but a memory. The company moved fast, no hesitation, no covering up. Within 24 hours, they called a press conference. The media gathered. Cameras flashed. The board of directors sat at a long, polished table. At the center, Ava Sinclair. Composed, powerful, unshaken. The CEO cleared his throat, spoke into the microphone. "As of today, Richard Coleman is no longer affiliated with this company." A murmur swept the room. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. The CEO continued. "We take workplace discrimination seriously, and today, we are taking action." He turned to Ava. "Ms. Sinclair, as our new regional director, you have the floor." Ava nodded, stood, walked to the microphone. The room fell silent. She surveyed the crowd, and then, she spoke. "This is only the start." The words hung in the air, firm, unshakable. Reporters leaned in. Employees watching the live stream held their breath. Ava continued. "For too long, people like Richard Coleman thrived in this company. That ends now." A shift rippled through the room. She paused. Then, with absolute authority, she announced the changes. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees. A full review of leadership. Anonymous reporting for harassment and abuse. New policies to ensure no one else could abuse their power. She listed them one by one. Each one, a direct hit against the toxic culture Coleman created. Some employees watching live teared up. For the first time, they felt hope. The culture was changing. The silence was breaking. And Coleman's era was officially erased. A reporter raised a hand. "Ms. Sinclair, how do you respond to those who say this is just corporate damage control?" "Ava?" She smiled. Sharp, calculated, full of certainty. "They will see the results soon enough." And she meant it. Because this was not about words. This was about real change. The company thrived under her leadership. For the first time in years, employees felt safe, respected, valued. And Ava? She did not stop there. She worked, she fought, she rebuilt. And every policy she implemented was another nail in the coffin of the system Coleman created. The company had been his playground. Now, it was hers, and it would never be the same again. Richard Coleman sat alone, in his dimly lit apartment, the curtains drawn, the TV screen glowing in front of him. His career? Over. His reputation? Destroyed. His phone? Dead silent. No calls, no emails, no job offers. He was blacklisted. He clenched his jaw, gripped the remote tightly, and watched. Because on screen was her, Ava Sinclair, standing tall at the press conference, cameras flashing, the entire city listening. A reporter leaned in, held out a microphone, and asked, "Ms. Sinclair, what do you have to say after this scandal?" The world held its breath. "Ava?" She smirked, not with arrogance, not with malice, but with certainty. And then, she spoke. "Actions have consequences." Coleman's grip on the remote tightened, his jaw locked. Because in that moment, He knew. She was not just talking about him. She was talking about all of them. Every corrupt manager, every bully, every abuser of power. Their time was up. Ava turned, walked away, leaving nothing but silence behind her. And then, the city cheered, loud, powerful, deafening. Richard Coleman? He sat there, frozen, because for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be powerless.